Psychotherapy of Preoedipal Conditions by Spotnitz, 1976. Emotional induction. It is well known that the presence of emotions in one individual may significantly influence the emotional state of another. This phenomenon is most dramatically illustrated by social psychologists, for example, McDougall, 1924, whose studies of the effect of the spread of similar emotions upon the actions and thoughts of large multitudes have facilitated the understanding of social and mass behavior. The significance of the phenomenon for psychotherapy has received little attention. Freud wrote about thought transference, mental telepathy, but did not report on the interpersonal transference of emotions. Brill, 1949, explicitly referred to the latter process in stating, of course, emotions beget emotions, page 224. He also observed that any marked emotional effect tends to arouse some patients from a congealed state p. 219. He did not, however, pursue the import of emotional induction for ego formation. Its therapeutic implications for people with emotional problems are focused on here. Value of emotions. What is the value of emotions per se? What role do they play in our functioning? All of us are aware that it is much easier to do something when we feel like doing it than when we do not. Behavior is facilitated by compatible emotions. The possession of a rich supply of compatible emotions eases our adjustment to immediate realities. The constant availability of such emotions enables us to function well spontaneously. How does emotional induction occur? Observations suggest that it is an unconscious process that operates constantly among human beings. However, the conditions under which they are most likely to react to this unconscious emotional influence are not known. Studies suggest that the greatest sensitivity to such influence obtains in the child-mother relationship, particularly in the infant, who seems to sense the parent's emotional state. Support for these observations has emerged from the psychoanalytic study of children and also of adults, such as the physically handicapped, for whom sensitivity to the emotions of others serves a self-protective purpose. Organization of emotions. It is important to distinguish between impulses toward emotional discharge and actual emotional discharge. The experiencing of an emotion appears to coincide with the acceptance of an impulse toward emotional discharge. When two individuals have the same impulse and the same attitudes about discharging it, both experience the same emotion. They will not do so, however, if these attitudes differ. In other words, similar impulses that are unconsciously held in check by different defense processes lead to the experiencing of dissimilar emotions, or the absence of emotions in the second individual. Impulses that are inhibited become intensified. The fact that emotions can be induced, therefore, suggests that the induction in a patient of a specific emotion or emotions whose relative absence has interfered with his achieving his potential in life might well be accepted as an essential aspect of the psychotherapeutic endeavor. The application of this principle, however, would not be easy. Considerations of timing and the appropriateness of one or another mode of functioning would be involved in the exploitation of the emotional induction factor for therapeutic purposes. Moreover, the possibility of inducing unhealthy emotions needs to be recognized and controlled. Hence, careful and prolonged therapeutic work may be entailed in the effective use of emotional induction. Clinical illustrations. When one individual induces emotions in another, the latter may be aware of the source of these emotions. For instance, a psychiatric social worker reporting on the case of a 12-year-old girl with a tendency toward anxiety and depression reported that her young client naively remarked, "I caught my fear of mice from my sister." In thus describing one factor in the development of this fear, she seemed to take it for granted that emotions could be caught in the same way as a contagious disease. Frequently, however, the individual in whom an emotion is induced is unable to account for it. A young man who was describing his introduction to a young woman at a party a few nights earlier said, "She was a beauty, but I muffed it. I just felt too disagreeable to be nice to her. I haven't the slightest idea why." Eventually, they met again and the young woman told him that he had aroused disagreeable feelings in her at first sight. He reminded her, she said, of someone who had always rubbed her the wrong way. This patient had known he was sensitive to his own feelings, but it came as a great surprise to him that he was also sensitive to the feelings of others. It has been repeatedly noted that members of therapy groups react to one another's emotions. Often they appear to be governed by the emotional attitude of the preceding speaker. At times they act in harmony with the induced feelings. This is illustrated by the successive reactions of adolescent girls to the suggestion of the group therapist that, instead of having refreshments at the social agency where the group held its sessions, they have it elsewhere when they finish their work. The therapist recorded the following material. Faye said that if she were to stop and eat before coming here, it would be too late, and she doesn't have enough money to eat out. Ethel works in a factory where she polishes diamonds. She carries her lunch and feels it would be too difficult to carry food for both meals. Belle, too, would find it difficult because she rushes to her job as soon as she leaves school, and she does not know how she could manage. And so it went down the line. Material from the same group session illustrates how differently individuals may react to the same emotional influence. At a time when their communications were unconsciously dominated by reproductive urges, one girl described a dream about having a baby, another verbalized sexual fantasies or recalled their childhood interest in dolls. At that point, another girl responded more maturely. Hilda expressed surprise as she heard these girls talking because it seemed to her that they all liked to indulge in impersonal things. They seemed to have imagination. They daydreamed. She and her sister, particularly her sister, never had any imagination. Her sister was just a regular down-to-earth person. As for Hilda herself, she never played with dolls. What she wanted was a real baby. Actually, she began early to take care of babies. Varied effects. Induced emotions may significantly influence the emotional attitude of the analysand toward the analyst. For instance, at a time when I was trying to find out how some of my analysands would respond to a feeling of self-restraint, I conveyed that feeling by remaining silent for a prolonged period. 6 different reactions were noted. One woman was delighted. She remained quiet for 45 minutes. At the next session, she said that she could not recall a situation in which she had felt more free to do nothing and really enjoy it. To another woman, my attitude of self-restraint signified anger. She said she could not bear feeling that she had made me angry. A young man did not object to my self-restraint. In the next session, he said that he had felt free to talk about whatever he pleased. Another man experienced my attitude as lack of interest. He felt that he was talking to himself during the session. A tense verbal outburst of hostility was the response of the 5th patient. Even though, the night before, she had enjoyed an orgasm during intercourse with her husband for the first time in several years, she felt that she was not benefiting in any way from the analysis. The 6th patient felt that the same attitude communicated criticism. An investigation of these reactions suggests that they were similar to those induced in the child-parent relationship when one or the other felt restrained. For example, the woman who experienced the self-restraint as criticism said, "Mother was dissatisfied with me from the day I was born. She would restrain herself for a long time and then explode, so I got to expect that her silences would end with some expression of disapproval." Emotional induction is an important factor to bear in mind when one is treating schizoid or schizophrenic patients. They sense the therapist's emotional attitude and may react to it with compliance or defiance. A schizoid man in his early 20s entered treatment because of psychosomatic symptoms, general malaise, and bizarre behavior. In the initial interview, after the preliminary arrangements had been made, he was directed to lie on the couch, but not told what he was to do there. The analyst was aware that he hoped the patient would spontaneously begin to talk. To his surprise and amazement, however, the young man spent the rest of the period relaxing on the couch, smoking cigarettes, crossing and recrossing his legs, stretching, and generally luxuriating in his newfound freedom without uttering a word. He appeared to be extremely comfortable. That impression was verified more than a year later, when he told the analyst that the first session was the most pleasant of his analysis. Accustomed as he was to being driven by his parents, he experienced the absence of pressure as permission to do as he pleased. It was subsequently confirmed that his silence had been based on a distinct emotional perception that the analyst wanted him to talk. Reacting to this desire, he had indulged his unconscious attitude of defiance because he had not been specifically instructed to talk. Reciprocal induction. In analytic therapy, emotional induction is a reciprocal process. As the patient develops a transference, the therapist usually develops a countertransference, which is based on unconscious reactions to the patient's transference attitudes and behavior. The effectiveness of the therapy depends in large measure on the therapist's ability to feel the patient's tendencies toward instinctual discharge. The capacity to sense his latent emotions and help him feel them determines whether their relationship is grounded in genuine emotional understanding or is primarily an intellectual exercise. In working with a severely disturbed patient, it is extremely important that one have the capacity to experience the emotions he induces and to help him verbalize them in the process of dealing with his resistances. Influencing the patient to feel his latent emotions is often difficult because he usually has no intimation of their existence. When exposed to them, his ego cannot function and his symptoms are defenses against such feelings. The therapist comes to feel them gradually and guides their discharge in language by working on the defenses. In the course of this work, the discharge patterns become more and more spontaneous and egosyntonic. The pressure to behave rigidly diminishes, and the patient becomes a more flexible and adaptable human being. Studies of patients undergoing psychoanalytic therapy lead to the recognition that integrated functioning of the ego requires that impulses be only partially gratified. The patient needs to become aware of his impulses gradually and also to restrain them sufficiently so that they become emotions, the driving fuel of the ego. An evolving ego is one that continually utilizes primitive impulses for emotions with which to perceive and react to external situations. Such studies have also consistently revealed that the damming up of aggressive impulses causes the most dangerous disruptions of personality functioning. If the patient feels these impulses in their full intensity, he tends to inhibit their release. They are therefore held in check by various devices. Thus inhibited, they give rise to destructive emotions in the patient and also tend to stimulate aggressive impulses in others. With a reciprocal induction of such impulses, an eruption of destructive behavior in the therapeutic situation becomes possible. Damaging changes in the patient and therapist or damaging action by either one or both parties are prevented by facilitating the rapid verbal discharge of the negative feelings aroused. On the other hand, if the patient has positive impulses toward the therapist and these induce similar impulses in the therapist, they will experience these impulses as mutual affection. This leads to the formation of a cooperative relationship in which they can help each other achieve the goals of the treatment. Furthermore, their joint analytic activity will tend to be more productive if they limit themselves to discharging their positive emotions in language. Such restraint will intensify these emotions, and the stronger the emotions, the more energy they will command for pursuing their common purpose. Cognizance of the emotional induction factor appears to facilitate the maturation of the preoedipal personality. Negative impulses can be neutralized by helping the patient discharge them in language, and healthful feelings can be induced by positive impulses in the therapist. Channelization and action. Impulses to action in one individual may arouse similar impulses in another. When their patterns for discharging an impulse are similarly organized, they experience the same type of emotions, characterized as induced emotions. Discharge processes stimulated in an individual whose discharge patterns are dissimilar to those of the inducing individual may lead to different emotions or to the absence of emotions. Inability to channelize primitive impulses in socially desirable ways may account for various psychological disturbances. A psychotherapist who has the capacity to sense the patient's impulses to action and also to recognize impulses and emotions they induce in himself can utilize these emotions to help the patient resolve his resistances. The induced emotions provide an additional source of therapeutic leverage in the treatment of the severely disturbed patient. Induced emotions are of particular importance in the treatment of patients with preverbal problems. The aggressive impulses of such patients require primary attention because they may develop into physically destructive patterns. These impulses can be neutralized by helping the patient discharge them in language. The presence of positive impulses in the therapist can induce healthful feelings in the patient and helps the patient channelize his destructive impulses into emotions which can be regulated.